His wife left him for her new boss and walked straight into a company her husband had owned since before she ever knew his name. This is the story of a quiet man who sat in the third pew of his church every Sunday for 8 years while his wife's family called him a charity case to his face, while his wife filed for divorce citing financial incompatibility, while her new man stood next to her in a leased Range Rover, accepting congratulations from people who had never once asked the quiet man a single question about himself. This is the story of what happened when they finally did. When a divorce lawyer opened a financial disclosure document and a congregation had to reckon with the fact that the man they had been pitying was the majority shareholder of a $32 billion company. And the woman who left him for a better life had been cashing his paychecks the entire time. Here is the question that will follow you through every minute of this story. What do you do when the people who humiliated you build their entire future inside something you already own? If that question just did something to your chest, hit that like button right now. And if you are new here, subscribe before this video is over because we do this every week. And drop your city in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from today. We have got people all over the world on this channel and we want to know where you are. Now let me take you back to where this started, to a Sunday morning in Memphis, a church parking lot, a Nexum Logistics badge being photographed for social media, and a quiet man in the third pew holding a quarterly report that nobody in that building thought to ask him about. The Sunday morning air in Memphis carried that particular weight it always did in late September, thick and warm, the kind that settled into your collar before you even reached the door. Riverside Baptist was already full when James Beaumont slipped into his seat. Third pew from the front, left side, same place he had sat for 11 years. He smoothed the front of his shirt. The blue one, the one Phyllis used to say, made him look like a city employee, which was fair, because he was, and he folded his hands in his lap, and he waited for service to begin. He was not a man who drew attention. That was not an accident. The congregation around him was dressed the way Riverside Baptist dressed on a good Sunday, linen suits in cream and charcoal, women in hats that cost more than James's monthly car note, men with pocket squares that matched their wives' shoes. James wore the blue shirt and a pair of dark slacks he had pressed himself that morning while the gospel station played low on the kitchen radio. He looked like what everyone in that building believed him to be. He looked like a man who had never amounted to much. He bowed his head when the pastor called for prayer. He sang when the choir rose. He dropped his envelope in the offering plate and passed it down the row without ceremony the way he did every week. If anyone in that sanctuary had been asked to describe James Beaumont, they would have said quiet. They would have said steady. Some of them, the kinder ones, would have said hard-working. None of them would have said anything that came close to the truth. The truth was sitting in a lockbox under the kitchen floorboards of a house on Dunbar Avenue. But that would come later. Service ran long that morning, the way it always did when the Spirit moved through the room with something extra. Pastor Gaines had been preaching on the theme of hidden things. The gifts buried in the ground, the light under the basket, the seed that falls quiet into the soil and makes no noise while it becomes something that cannot be ignored. James listened with his hands still in his lap. He did not think the sermon was about him. He did not think much of anything. He just listened and waited, and when the final hymn came, he rose with everyone else and sang the words he had known since he was 7 years old. It was after the benediction that Phyllis walked to the front. She was dressed in ivory, which James noticed because she almost never wore ivory. She said it was a color that required confidence. She had the confidence now. She had it in the set of her shoulders and the angle of her chin and the way she held the small laminated badge in her right hand like it was a credential being presented to a board. Derek Holt stood 3 feet behind her, Range Rover keys visible on the clip at his belt, one hand resting lightly at the small of her back. He had the look of a man who had decided some years ago that every room he entered was fortunate to have him. Phyllis cleared her throat, and the room quieted the way rooms do when something is about to happen that everyone can already feel. She said she had 2 things to share with her church family. She said she wanted them to hear it from her directly, and she wanted to praise God for the open doors. The first thing was that she had accepted a position as client relations manager at Nexum Logistics Solutions, $112,000 a year. She said the number clearly, the way you say a number when you want it to land in the room and stay there. A ripple moved through the congregation, approving murmurs, a few amens, a woman in the 4th row who pressed her hand to her chest like it was almost too much. The second thing was that she had filed for divorce from James Beaumont on the grounds of financial incompatibility, and she asked for the congregation's prayers and understanding as she stepped into this new season of her life. The applause started before she finished the sentence. James did not move. He sat in the 3rd pew with his hands folded and his face arranged into an expression that gave nothing away. He had spent 8 years developing that expression. He wore it the way other men wore a watch, quietly, reliably, without drawing attention to the craft of it. Curtis Beaumont Reeves was on his feet near the side aisle, working the room with the ease of a man who had spent 40 years in municipal politics. He shook hands and accepted congratulations as though he had personally arranged the whole thing, which, James understood, he largely had. Tanya had her phone out before the clapping stopped. She photographed the Nexum badge in Phyllis's hand from 2 different angles and posted both before they reached the parking lot. James knew this because he heard her tell Phyllis the second photo had better lighting. Outside, in the gravel lot, Derek Holt extended his hand. James shook it. He looked at the Nexum lanyard around the man's neck, the small logo in blue and white, the name he had seen on page 1 of a quarterly report 3 years running. He said quietly, "I know the name." Derek Holt laughed like it was a compliment. He clapped James on the shoulder once and turned back to Phyllis, and that was the end of that. Nobody asked James what he meant. He walked to the Buick. He drove home on streets he had driven for 11 years, past the barber shop on Lamar that didn't open until noon on Sundays, past the gas station where the price on unleaded had gone up 3 cents since Thursday, past the elementary school where the crossing guard knew his name and waved even when there were no children to cross. He drove the way he did everything, without performance, without hurry, without any visible sign of what was moving through him. The house on Dunbar Avenue was quiet. He hung his keys by the door. He put water on for coffee, and then he sat down at the kitchen table, and he looked at the piece of mail that had been sitting there since Friday, the one he had not yet opened, the one with the return address of a law office in Nashville that he had been receiving correspondence from for 22 years. It was the quarterly report from Beaumont Freight Holdings. He turned to page 1. Under the heading Recent Subsidiary Activity, in the same clean serif font the report had always used, was a line he had read before but had not yet decided what to do about. Nexum Logistics Solutions, wholly owned subsidiary. Acquisition completed 11 months prior. James set the report down on the table. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Outside, a car rolled slow down Dunbar Avenue with its windows down, and the faint sound of a bass line drifted through the screen door and faded. He sat there for a long time. To understand what he did next and why he did it the way he did, you have to understand how he got to that table. You have to understand the years that built the man who could sit in the 3rd pew while his wife announced her departure to a standing ovation and feel nothing that looked like what it was. That story does not start on a Sunday morning. It starts 8 years earlier at a dinner table in Germantown, where a man named Curtis Beaumont Reeves looked at James Beaumont for the first time and asked him what he made. The first family dinner happened 3 months after James and Phyllis got married. Phyllis had talked about it for 2 weeks beforehand. Rehearsing it the way you rehearse something you already know is going to be difficult. She told James to wear the grey blazer. She told him to let her father lead the conversation. She told him twice not to talk about the city job right away. James wore the grey blazer. He let Curtis lead. The house in Germantown was the kind of house that had been designed to make visitors aware of what they did not have. The ceilings were high, the furniture was heavy and pale. There was a painting above the fireplace that Curtis mentioned was an original, though he did not say by whom, because the point was not the artist. The point was that it was original. Curtis shook James's hand at the door with the particular firmness of a man who grades other men by their grip, found the results acceptable but not impressive, and led him inside. They sat down to pot roast and sweet potatoes and a green bean dish that Tanya announced she had made herself, though James later learned she had purchased it from a restaurant on Poplar Avenue and transferred it to a ceramic dish. The conversation moved through weather and church announcements and the new development going up on the east side of town. And then Curtis set his fork down and looked at James with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who had been waiting for the right moment. He asked James what he made. James told him, $47,000 a year with benefits. Curtis nodded slowly, the way a doctor nods when a test result confirms what he already suspected. He picked his fork back up. He said that was a decent starting point. He said it the way you say it when you mean the opposite. That was the first small death. The pattern that followed was not dramatic. It never announced itself. It arrived the way a slow leak arrives, quietly, consistently, until one day you notice the floor is wet and you cannot remember when it started. Every Thanksgiving, every Easter, every birthday dinner at the Germantown house carried the same current underneath it. Curtis would mention a colleague's promotion, a neighbor's renovation, a friend of Phyllis's whose husband had just made partner, and the mention would sit in the air for a moment before he would look at James with that same calm, measuring expression. Tanya was subtler, but more surgical. She had a gift for the compliment that contained its own wound. Telling Phyllis her house was cozy, telling James his car ran well for its age. Phyllis in those early years would sometimes catch James's eye across the table and hold it for a moment, a brief signal that she saw what was happening. But the signal grew less frequent over time, and then it stopped. James never argued, never corrected. He fixed Curtis's garage door the October it stopped responding to the remote. He re-corked the bathtub at Tanya's apartment on a Saturday morning when Tanya's boyfriend at the time had promised to do it and didn't. He drove his mother-in-law to her cardiology appointment when Curtis was at a council meeting and stayed in the waiting room for 3 hours reading a magazine he had already read. He did these things without announcement, without resentment, without any expectation of credit. He did them because he was that kind of man. Nobody interpreted it that way. There was one evening, about 4 years into the marriage, when James came close to telling Phyllis the truth. They were washing dishes after dinner. One of the few nights they cooked at home, chicken and rice, the gospel station low on the counter radio. James dried a plate and started a sentence. He said there was something about his family he had never really explained, something his father had set up a long time ago that she probably should know about. Phyllis's phone rang. It was Tanya. She held up one finger and walked into the other room. She was on the phone for 40 minutes. By the time she came back, James had finished the dishes and the moment had passed and he never started the sentence again. Once a year, without exception, Harriet Ngozi called. The calls lasted between 12 and 20 minutes. Harriet would walk him through the holdings summary, current valuation, subsidiary activity, board decisions, any material changes to his equity position. James took these calls from his car, parked in the Riverside Baptist lot after Wednesday evening service, engine off, windows up. He would listen. He would ask 2 or 3 questions. He would say, "Thank you," and drive home. He never wrote anything down. He kept everything in the same place his father had told him to keep important things, in his head and in a lockbox, and absolutely nowhere else. The Christmas dinner where Tanya made her announcement came 5 years in. The table was full. Curtis at the head, Phyllis's aunt, and her husband down from Nashville, 2 of Tanya's friends who appeared at every gathering and functioned as a kind of audience. The wine had been opened twice. The sweet potato pie was half gone. And Tanya, in a voice she calibrated to carry to every corner of the room, said that she just wanted to say, and she looked at Phyllis when she said it, that her sister deserved a man who could give her a life, not just a ride. The table laughed, not all of it, but enough. James looked at his pie. He took a bite. He said nothing. What Tanya did not know, what none of them knew, what no one in that room had ever thought to ask, was what James had been quietly sitting on since the year he turned 19. And they were about to find out. 3 years before Phyllis walked to the front of Riverside Baptist and announced her new life to a standing ovation, something happened that set everything that followed in motion. It began with a phone call from Harriet Ngozi that was different from all the others. 11 months later, Phyllis handed James the divorce papers on a Tuesday evening, setting them on the kitchen counter the way you set down something you have been carrying for a long time and are relieved to put down. She did not look at him when she did it. She had already arranged to stay at her mother's house that night, and her overnight bag was already by the door, and the conversation she offered him was brief and final, and entirely without apology. James picked up the papers. He read them through once, slowly, the way he read everything. He set them back down. He did not say a word that she had not already anticipated, because he did not say anything at all. She was gone by 7 o'clock. James went to the kitchen. He moved the small rug near the refrigerator. He lifted the board his father had shown him, the one that looked like every other board in the floor but was not, and he reached into the space beneath it, and he retrieved the lockbox. Steel grey, 12 inches long, the combination set to a number only he knew. Inside was a single document, the ownership summary Harriet had prepared 3 years prior, the one he had reviewed on the night of the business breakfast and filed without telling another soul. He put the lockbox on the kitchen table next to the quarterly report from Beaumont Freight Holdings. He looked at both of them for a long moment. Then he called Harriet Ngozi. She answered on the second ring. He said he needed to come in. She said Monday morning. He said that worked fine. Harriet Ngozi's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Main Street in downtown Memphis, the kind of office that said its occupant had been doing serious work for a long time and had no need to announce it with excess decoration. The furniture was dark wood, and the bookshelves were full, and the window behind her desk looked out over the river. On clear mornings, it was a clear morning. James sat across from her with the lockbox on the chair beside him and the quarterly report in his hands, and he said he thought it was time to talk through the full picture. Harriet already knew the picture. She had been maintaining it for 22 years, but she spread it out anyway because James had asked her to lay it flat, and because she understood that there is a difference between knowing something and seeing it all at once on a conference table. Beaumont Freight Holdings, privately held. Incorporated in 1999 in James's name by his father, Clifton Beaumont, as a protective structure during a business dispute that was ultimately resolved in the family's favor. James had been the majority shareholder since the incorporation date. 61% equity. The company had grown under professional management across 2 decades, never drawing James into operational involvement, never requiring him to change a single visible detail of his daily life. Current enterprise value, $32 billion. Current liquid assets attributable to James's position, $847 million. James listened to all of it the way he always listened, still attentive without visible reaction. Then Harriet placed a single page on the table between them and pointed to a line near the bottom. Nexum Logistics Solutions, wholly owned subsidiary of Beaumont Freight Holdings. Acquisition completed 11 months prior. She let that sit for a moment. She told him what it meant in plain terms. Phyllis's client relations manager salary, $112,000 per year, was funded through Nexum's Memphis operating budget, which flowed from Holdings subsidiary allocation, which flowed from the company that bore his family's name and had held his majority equity since before Phyllis ever knew his last name. Derek Holt's authority as regional director. The title, the budget, the power to create positions and sponsor hires, derived from a chain of command that terminated at a board that answered to James. Every paycheck Phyllis would receive, every benefits enrollment form, every direct deposit into whatever account she had opened in her new life, all of it traced back to the man she had left for financial incompatibility. James looked at the page for a long time. He asked Harriet 2 questions. The first was whether the divorce discovery process would require full financial disclosure. She said yes, it would. Phyllis's attorney had filed a standard discovery request, and Harriet was obligated to respond with a complete accounting of James's assets. The financial incompatibility claim, she said, would be part of the public court record. James nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something he has been waiting for finally arrives on schedule. The second question was whether they could do this without destroying anyone who did not deserve it. Harriet said yes. She said the corporate mechanisms were already in motion for things that had nothing to do with James personally. She said all she needed from him was authorization to proceed, and that everything that followed would move through proper channels. James was quiet for a moment. Then he asked one more thing. He asked whether they could do it precisely. Harriet looked at him across the conference table. And for the first time in 22 years of annual briefing calls and legal correspondence and document preparation, she smiled. She slid the authorization forms across the table. James read each page. He signed where indicated, clearly and without hesitation. He returned the pen. He picked up the lockbox and the quarterly report, and he thanked Harriet for her time. He drove back to work in the Buick, arriving 4 minutes before his shift started, and he spent the rest of the day doing his job the way he always did, carefully, quietly, without drawing any particular attention to himself. Harriet, meanwhile, began making calls. Not one of them was to anyone James knew personally. Not one of them needed to be. The week after James signed the authorization documents was the quietest week he had lived in years. He went to work. He came home. He ate dinner at the kitchen table with the radio on low. He did not call Phyllis. He did not call Curtis. He did not call anyone who was waiting for him to react. And there were several people waiting because people who believe they have hurt you are always watching to see the wound. He let them watch. There was nothing to see. Harriet, meanwhile, was not quiet at all. She moved the way she always moved, precisely without visible urgency, each action arriving in the correct sequence at the correct moment. She spent Monday and Tuesday in consultation with the General Counsel of Beaumont Freight Holdings, a man named Walter Obie, who had been with the company for 14 years and who understood immediately what was being asked and why. Together they mapped the full strategy across a conference table on the 14th floor, and the strategy was this. Everything that was about to happen would happen through proper channels. No anonymous tips to gossip networks, no personal interference, no fingerprints that traced back to James Beaumont the man, as distinct from Beaumont Freight Holdings the company. The institution would do what institutions do. James would simply stop preventing it. Walter explained the 3 actions that would run simultaneously, and he explained them in the same tone he used for every Holdings matter. Calm, technical, entirely without drama. The first was the divorce financial disclosure. Phyllis's attorney had filed a standard discovery request as part of the proceedings. Harriet was legally obligated to respond with a complete and accurate accounting of James's financial position. She would do exactly that. The document would be thorough, precise, and entirely devastating to the premise of Phyllis's filing. It would enter the public court record the way all such documents did, without announcement, without ceremony, available to anyone who knew to look. The second was the Nexam Human Resources Compliance Review. Beaumont Holdings had acquired Nexam 11 months prior and had not yet completed the standard post-acquisition HR audit that all subsidiary companies were required to undergo within the first 12 months of ownership. This was not unusual, it was not targeted, it was, in the most literal sense, standard procedure. The kind of administrative process that happened to every acquired company, documented in the acquisition agreement required by the Holdings Board. Walter had already commissioned it through the Holdings legal department. The review team would begin the following Monday. They would examine personnel files, hiring records, approval chains, and conduct histories across all Nexam divisions. They would find what they found. Walter did not speculate about what that would be. He did not need to. The third was the vendor audit. Beaumont Holdings conducted regular reviews of city and municipal contracts across all markets in which its subsidiaries operated. Memphis was one such market. A routine examination of freight contracting records for the city of Memphis had been added to the Holdings legal team's quarterly workload. If that examination surfaced irregularities in how contracts had been awarded or withheld relative to Holdings affiliated companies, the findings would be referred to the appropriate city oversight body. That was the procedure, that was all it was. James listened to all of this without interrupting. When Walter finished, James had one instruction and one instruction only. He told Harriet that if the vendor audit produced findings related to any individual, and he did not name Curtis because he did not need to, those findings were to be submitted to the city's ethics office and nowhere else, not to the press, not to anyone with a social media account or reason to make noise. The institution would handle it through the institution. James would not be the one to publicly destroy a man, even a man who had spent 8 years treating him like a charity case at his own dinner table. Harriet noted the instruction without comment. Walter noted it as well. Neither of them said anything further about it because there was nothing further to say. The disclosure documents were ready by Thursday afternoon. Harriet's office sent them by courier to the offices of Phyllis's attorney, a firm on Union Avenue. The courier arrived at 2:47 in the afternoon. The documents were signed for at 2:49. At 4:33, Phyllis's attorney called her. James was on his way home from work when his phone showed the time. He did not know exactly what was being said on that call. He did not need to know. He knew the documents. He had reviewed every page before signing the authorization. He knew what Phyllis's attorney was reading to her, and he knew what Phyllis was hearing for the first time. The number, the equity position, the company name, the subsidiary line that contained a name she had been celebrating for the past 2 weeks as proof of her better life. He pulled into the driveway on Dunbar Avenue. He turned off the engine. He sat for a moment in the quiet of the car, the way he had sat in the church parking lot for 8 years, taking Harriet's annual calls. Then he went inside, put a pot of water on for rice, and turned the radio to the gospel station. Phyllis's attorney called her at 4:33. The call lasted 40 minutes. James learned this later, not because anyone told him, but because 40 minutes was exactly how long it took a person to hear something that destroyed a premise they had staked their entire public identity on and find a way to breathe again. By Sunday morning, the third pew knew everything, and then some. It started on a Sunday. Not with a confrontation, not with a phone call from James. It started the way James did everything, quietly, without announcement, through a document that arrived in the right hands at the right time, and let the truth do what truth does when you finally stop holding it back. The financial disclosure hit Phyllis's attorney's office on a Thursday. By Sunday, it had travelled the full length of Riverside Baptist's congregation like a current through still water. Nobody announced it from the front. Nobody had to. Someone had told someone who had told someone else, and by the time the morning benediction was over, half the parking lot was doing arithmetic they couldn't believe. $847 million in liquid assets. 61% majority equity in a $32 billion company. The man in the blue shirt. The man in the 10-year-old Buick. The man Tanya had called a ride and not a life at her father's Christmas table in front of witnesses, Phyllis's own friends, the ones who had applauded her announcement 2 Sundays prior, the ones who had hugged her in the vestibule and called her brave, were now quoting her divorce, filing back to her in text messages she did not know how to answer. Financial incompatibility. The phrase had been her sword. It had become a joke she was trapped inside. Tanya deleted the Nexum badge post before noon that Sunday. She did not replace it with anything. She went quiet in a way that was louder than anything she had ever said. That was week 2. Week 3 moved faster. The Nexum Human Resources Compliance Review team arrived at the Memphis office on a Monday morning with clipboards and access credentials and the particular energy of people who have been authorized to look at everything. They were polite. They were thorough. They were not there for drama. They were there for documentation, and documentation was exactly what they found. Derek Holt's personnel file was a problem from the first hour. 3 approval stages had been bypassed when Phyllis's client relations manager position was created and filled. 3. The paper trail on the irregular hiring was not subtle. It was the kind of trail that existed because the person who created it had never imagined anyone would look. Derek's broader conduct history compounded it. A documented pattern across 2 prior positions, complaints that had been managed quietly rather than properly. The review team noted everything. They submitted their findings to Holdings General Counsel the following Friday. Derek Holt was terminated for cause on a Wednesday morning. No severance, no letter of reference. He was walked out of the Nexum Memphis office with a cardboard box and the kind of expression that belongs to a man who has just realized the ground he was standing on was never as solid as he believed. The Range Rover went back to the dealership within 30 days. It had been leased against his employment. The employment was gone. Week 4. Phyllis received a call from Nexum's Human Resources Department on a Tuesday. The position she held had been created and filled in violation of the company's standard hiring protocol, sponsored by a director who had since been terminated for cause. The position was therefore void. Her employment was ended effective immediately. She would receive 2 weeks of pay. There was paperwork to sign before she left the building. She signed it. Later, she would say she had not fully read it. That was probably true. It was a non-disclosure agreement, and it foreclosed several avenues she might otherwise have pursued. She signed it in the Nexum Memphis lobby with a pen the HR coordinator handed her, and then she was escorted to the door. The badge Tanya had photographed from 2 angles for better lighting was deactivated before Phyllis reached her car. Week 6 arrived like a season change, the kind you feel before you see. The City of Memphis Ethics Office received a referral from Beaumont Holdings' legal team regarding the municipal freight contracting records for the past 7 years. The referral was factual, documented, and submitted through the proper institutional channel. It did not go to the press. It did not go to anyone with a reason to make noise. It went to the office that existed precisely to examine this kind of thing. The examination didn't take long. The pattern of contract steering away from Holdings-affiliated companies running directly parallel to Alderman Curtis Beaumont Reeves's tenure on the relevant municipal committee was not ambiguous. The ethics investigation was opened officially. The local news covered it on a Thursday evening. Curtis's name was on screen for 11 seconds. He did not return calls, not from reporters, not from colleagues, not from the council members who had considered him an ally the week before. His office phone rang. He let it ring. Week 10 was Tanya. The boutique loan had been co-signed against Curtis's institutional credibility and his relationships with the lending contacts he had cultivated over 4 decades in city politics. The moment his name appeared under an ethics investigation headline, That credibility became a liability. The bank reviewed the loan's terms. The co-signers' standing had materially changed. They declined to extend. They called the note. Tanya's boutique closed in 90 days. The woman who had built 8 years of family narrative around being the successful one, the one with the thriving business, the one whose brother-in-law couldn't keep up, watched her storefront go dark and said nothing publicly. There was nothing to say. The story had inverted completely, and everyone who had listened to the original version was now reading the correction. Phyllis sat in her father's house in Germantown and watched the evening news and said nothing either. She was unemployed. Her new relationship had ended in a termination memo. Her father's name was being discussed by a television anchor in the past tense of a man whose career is over. Her sister's business was gone. The divorce filing she had made in open court, the one citing financial incompatibility, was a public document available to anyone who wanted to read it. Several people had read it. Several more were going to. Every pillar of the life she had chosen over James had fallen. And every single one of them had fallen because of processes that James had not personally initiated, had not publicly announced, and had not once called her to discuss. He had not called, had not texted, had not appeared until now. 10 weeks after Phyllis stood at the front of Riverside Baptist and received a standing ovation for leaving her husband, James Beaumont pulled the Buick into the church parking lot and cut the engine. Same shirt, same pew, same gravel lot. He sat in the car for a moment, the way he always did, before going in, not hesitating, just settling. He smoothed the front of the blue shirt. He got out. He walked through the front doors of Riverside Baptist the way he had walked through them for 11 years, and he took his seat in the third pew from the front, left side, and he folded his hands and he waited for service to begin. Curtis was not there. Curtis had not been to Riverside Baptist since the ethics investigation went public. His seat, the aisle seat 3 rows back from the pulpit, the one he had occupied with the ease of a man who considered a room his simply by entering it, was empty. It looked smaller somehow without him in it. Phyllis was there. She came in late, after the opening hymn had already started, and she took a seat near the back, rather than her usual place near the front. She was dressed carefully, the kind of careful that takes longer than it appears, but something in her face had changed in 10 weeks in a way that clothing could not address. She did not look broken. She looked like a woman who had been trying very hard not to look broken, which is a different thing and more exhausting. She saw James in the third pew. He did not turn around. He already knew she was there. Service ran its course. Pastor Gaines preached on the theme of reckoning, the debt that finds you, the accounting that cannot be postponed, and the irony of the text was not lost on anyone in that building who knew what they knew, which by that point was most of them. James listened with his hands in his lap. He sang when the choir rose. He dropped his envelope in the plate and passed it down the row. When the benediction was spoken and the congregation began to move toward the doors, James walked out through the side exit and stood beside the Buick in the gravel lot. He was not waiting dramatically. He was simply standing where he had parked, the way a man stands when he has nowhere urgent to be and no performance to give. Phyllis found him there. She came across the lot with purpose in her step, the kind that belongs to anger, looking for a shape to take. She started to speak before she fully reached him. Her voice was tight and controlled, and barely either of those things. She said she wanted to know what he had done. She said she wanted to know if he had engineered all of it, the review, the audit, the disclosure, and whether he had been planning it from the beginning. James let her finish. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, directly, without performance, without the studied patience that implies contempt. When she was done, he spoke. And he spoke the way he had been unable to speak for 8 years. Not because the words weren't there, but because the moment hadn't been. He told her about his father. He told her that Clifton Beaumont had incorporated the company in James's name in 1999 when James was 19 years old, to protect assets during a dispute that ultimately resolved in the family's favor. He told her that Clifton had sat him down that same year before the papers were signed and had said one thing to him clearly, that the world will always underestimate a quiet man, and that a quiet man's greatest advantage is that he never corrects them. He told her about Harriet and Gozy, about the annual calls he took from the church parking lot, 12 minutes each, windows up, engine off, about the 22 years of quarterly reports that arrived at a Nashville law office address and were forwarded without fanfare, about the lockbox under the kitchen floor, in the exact spot his father had shown him, with the combination set to the year Beaumont Freight Holdings was incorporated. He told her about the night of the church business breakfast 3 years prior, when Derek Holt walked into a room wearing a Nexum lanyard and gave a motivational speech to a congregation that included the man who owned the company on that lanyard. He told her what it felt like to shake Derek's hand and say 3 words, "I know the name," and watch the man laugh because he thought it was a compliment. And then James looked at Phyllis directly and said the thing that had been true for the entirety of their marriage, the thing that had been sitting under the kitchen floor next to the lockbox, patient and undisturbed and waiting for exactly this moment. He said, "You stood up in the house of God and told these people you finally found a room worthy of you. What you didn't know was that the room had my name on the deed since before I ever met you. And every check, Nexum cut, you came out of my account." The parking lot was very quiet. Phyllis did not speak. There was nothing to navigate toward, no partial truth to dispute, no gap in the account where doubt could enter. It was complete. It sat in the air between them like something solid, and she had no answer for it because there was no answer. There was only the arithmetic of 8 years resolving to a sum she had not anticipated. James waited. He gave her a full and respectful moment of silence, not out of cruelty, but because the moment deserved its weight. Then he told her the divorce would be uncontested on his side. He told her the settlement would be fair, that Harriet had already prepared terms that any reasonable person would find generous, and that he had approved them without revision. He told her he wished her well, and he meant it in the straightforward way that a man means something when he has no remaining anger attached to it. He did not say anything else. He got into the Buick. He started the engine. He pulled out of the gravel lot of Riverside Baptist without looking in the rearview mirror, not because he was performing indifference, but because there was genuinely nothing behind him that required his attention anymore. 3 months passed. Memphis moved on, and James Beaumont moved forward. 3 months after James Beaumont pulled out of the Riverside Baptist parking lot without looking back, the city of Memphis had largely moved on to other things. That is the nature of cities. They absorb their dramas, file them away, and keep moving. But the people who had been inside that drama, the ones who had participated in it, profited from it, or been quietly destroyed by it, those people did not move on so easily. Phyllis's divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in a Shelby County courtroom with no audience and no theatrics. The settlement Harriet had prepared was generous by any reasonable measure. Phyllis's attorney reviewed it twice, looking for a catch that was not there, because Harriet did not operate with catches. Phyllis signed. James did not attend the proceeding. There was no reason for him to be there, and he was at work. 2 weeks after the finalization, Phyllis relocated to Atlanta. She did not make an announcement. She did not post about it. She left Memphis the way people leave places that have become impossible to inhabit, quietly, in a car, with what she could carry. Curtis Beaumont Reeves received the findings of the city ethics investigation in a formal letter delivered to his office on a Thursday. The investigation had been thorough, and the findings were unambiguous. 7 years of freight contract steering, documented across procurement records that should have been routine but were not. The censure was official. His aldermanic seat, the one he had held for 9 years, the one he had used to build a reputation as a man of consequence in this city, was surrendered without contest. He did not seek re-election. He did not hold a press conference. He issued a 2-paragraph statement through an attorney and went silent in the way that men go silent when they have nothing left to stand behind. Tanya's boutique did not reopen under the same name or the same arrangement. She found a smaller space, a fraction of the original square footage, and she started again without a co-signed loan and without her father's political connections smoothing the path. It was harder. It was also, for the first time, entirely hers. Nobody in the family commented on the difference, because there was nothing comfortable to say about it. Derek Holt was last publicly visible on a professional networking platform where his profile listed him as an independent sales consultant based in Nashville. His title had been updated 4 times in 2 months. Each update was a smaller claim than the one before it. The Range Rover, the motivational speeches, the hand on Phyllis's back in the church vestibule, all of it had dissolved back into the atmosphere as completely as a morning that never quite became a day. James activated the Beaumont Foundation on a Wednesday in October, 3 months after the parking lot confrontation, in a small ceremony at Riverside Baptist's Fellowship Hall. The Logistics Apprenticeship Program, a 12-week training pipeline for formerly incarcerated men, partnered with 3 Memphis area freight companies for guaranteed placement interviews, launched its first cohort of 24 men that same week. The program was funded entirely through the foundation. James's name was not on the building. It was not on the curriculum materials. It was not on the signage outside the fellowship hall. It was only on the legal documents where names belong when they are doing actual work. The Memphis Business Journal ran a piece on the foundation in its November issue. The reporter had asked James for a comment, and James had given one. He said that his grandfather, Clifton Beaumont, had believed that the measure of a man was not what he accumulated, but what he made possible for the people coming up behind him, and that the foundation was an attempt to honor that belief in a practical way. That was the entire quote. The reporter had waited to see if there was more. There was not. James still drove the Buick. He had been offered, through Harriet, several options that made more obvious sense given his actual net worth. He had declined all of them. The Buick ran well. He knew its particular sounds, its particular silences. It had carried him to every Harriet phone call, every family dinner, every Sunday service for 11 years, and it had never once failed him. He saw no reason to be ungrateful to a reliable thing simply because he could afford to replace it. He still sat in the 3rd pew. It was at the foundation launch that he met Celeste. She came with a mutual friend named Denise, a woman from the church who had been involved in coordinating the fellowship hall space for the event. Celeste was a pediatric nurse at a children's hospital on the east side of Memphis. She had come because Denise had asked her to come, and she had nothing more important to do that Wednesday evening. At the end of the event, when the room was thinning and people were collecting their coats, Celeste asked James what he did. He said freight. She said, okay. She asked a follow-up question, not about the foundation, not about the numbers, not about any of the things that had been circulating through the congregation for 3 months. She asked whether he had always been interested in logistics, or whether it was something he had fallen into. It was a real question. She wanted a real answer. He told her about his father, about growing up watching Clifton Beaumont treat every load, every route, every delivery confirmation as something that mattered because it mattered to someone on the other end. She listened the way people listen when they are actually listening. James asked if she wanted to get dinner. She said yes. They found a corner table at a restaurant 2 blocks from the church, the kind of place with low lighting and no television screens and menus that did not need to announce themselves. They sat across from each other with no phones on the table. They talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with $32 billion or a financial incompatibility filing or a parking lot in October. They talked the way people talk when they have found someone worth talking to and nowhere else they need to be. This is what the end of the story looks like. Not a trophy, not a press release, not a man standing over the ruins of the people who underestimated him with his arms spread wide. Just a corner table, two people, the gospel station playing low somewhere in the back, and a quiet man who had been patient long enough to arrive at exactly the life he deserved. Here is what James Beaumont understood that the people around him never did. Some people perform wealth. They wear it, announce it, photograph it, use it to tell other people who they are. And some people simply hold it. They carry it the way his grandfather carried a belief, the way a seed carries a tree, quietly, without display, without needing anyone to see the root system to trust that it is there. The ones who hold it quietly are the ones you never see coming. And now it is your turn. If you had been in James's position, if you had sat in that third pew for 8 years, knowing what he knew, watching what he watched, saying nothing, what would you have done? Would you have walked away sooner? Would you have said more? Or would you have done exactly what he did? Waited for the moment when the truth could speak for itself and let it speak. Leave your answer in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story moved something in you today, hit that like button one more time before you go. It helps more people find this channel, and this channel exists for exactly that purpose. We will see you in the next one.